Well, thank you for inviting me to the conference. And I looked at the agenda. It's very full and stimulating, so I'll make my remarks brief so that you can get on with the program and also eat lunch. If you look, what I want to do is give you an overview of the status of connectivity in the emerging markets. And then I want to tell you some of the technical challenges that we're facing, and then also some of the work that Google's doing, and perhaps how we can partner with many of you in that endeavor, because it's a big, big problem that we're trying to solve. So, excuse me, if you look at the amount of connectivity in the last few years that's been established in the emerging markets, it's really incredible. The blue light on the bars depicts what are commonly thought of as developing markets or emerging markets. There are many terms. Some of them are right here, so it doesn't mean we're just talking about India and Africa. And then the yellow bar is primarily the domestic and Western European markets. So you can see that if you extrapolate from here until 2020, the developing markets and the number of subscribers and the amount of connectivity takes off like a hockey stick. It's very exponential in terms of its growth. Whereas with the domestic markets, they're fairly saturated and flat. So when people ask me, why did you leave a career at AT&T, which I was very happy at, to work in the emerging markets, I tell them that's where all the people are, and that's where all the people will be. And so I think it's important for all of us in this, ecosystem to start thinking like that. If you look at the emerging markets plus the developed markets, 95%, 7 billion people on Earth, now live within a region that's at least covered by a cellular network. And 2/3 of the world's population lives in a region that's covered by a broadband network, which means it supports speeds up to 3G and above. So that's really remarkable when you think about it, especially when you compare it to about 10 years ago. It was a very different story. And even LTE now covers about 4 billion people on Earth. And a lot of the acceleration of the deployment of 4G and LTE networks is happening in the emerging markets, especially in countries like India and countries in South America. So there's an awful lot of progress that has been made and continues to be made. So let's just quickly look at the characteristics of the subscribers in the emerging markets. First, they're a mobile first generation. Very few have been tethered to a desktop computer, and they use their mobile devices for both work and business reasons. Many of them are smartphone users, a growing amount. In fact, it's been said that by 2020, there'll be a 60% growth rate in the penetration of smartphones in the emerging markets. And the people that have to use mobile devices in the emerging markets, I give them a lot of credit. They're very savvy in terms of the economics of connectivity. They are very adept at using multiple SIMs and changing out SIMs on a dime as soon as a plan changes and it's more economical. And they often use shared phones as well. And 80% of them are prepaid users. So they monitor their usage very carefully. They're young. 45% of them are under the age of 25. They're also increasingly becoming urbanized. 90% of the population growth in India is predicted to be in the cities. And in Indonesia and Brazil, which are very huge countries in terms of the emerging markets, 115% of the growth rate is in urban areas. And that's a very important trend because city dwellers tend to be early adopters of technology. And we find that there's a 3-to-1 ratio in terms of smartphone usage between city dwellers and those that live in rural areas. So that's going to really impact the growth of not only smartphone usage, but the broadband networks that they really drive the development and the deployment of. And then finally, even though there's tremendous poverty within the emerging markets, there's a growing amount of affluence there. And not just within the upper tier, but also within the bottom tier, there's beginning to be growth in the amount of disposable income that users have. So all of that is very good. It's heartening to see the progress that's being made and the uplifting that's going on in these markets. However, if you look at the state of internet access, right, you can see that despite the fact that there is sufficient coverage, right, that people live within the range of coverage in the emerging markets and across the world, only slightly more than, I'd say, 50% or slightly less than 50% of the people on Earth have gone online just once, right? So slightly more than 50% have never gone online. And that's especially true in the areas that are marked in red and yellow, and moderately true in the areas in green. So in Africa, 75% of the people have never been online. In Asia and the Pacific Islands, 60% of the people have never been online. And each of these regions have very unique reasons and barriers that creates this obstacle, but all of them have faced a subset of similar challenges. So often they have very low spec phones with limited memory and storage. In terms of connectivity, the data plans are often, or data I should say, is often slow, and the plans are expensive. Networks tend to be unreliable, congested, and bandwidth constrained. And the power sources in these countries tend to be very unstable and erratic. And then finally, the content that's available to people once they get online can often be very irrelevant in some of these markets. Hindi, which is the 4th largest spoken language in the world, has 1/50th the content in Wikipedia available in Hindi than in English. So it's only as of late that people are beginning to recognize that while the internet brings globalization, there is not globalization on the internet. So Google, as I'm sure many of you who represent companies that provide content and services and applications is trying to address this problem. And we're not only trying to make sure that the applications that we develop are less bandwidth intense, but also that there's a lot of localization going on, both in terms of language as well as relevant content. And this work is very dynamic, and it's being aggressively addressed. So these numbers are probably out of date by now, and there's even more languages available for each of the most popular applications that Google supports in the emerging markets. So this is one major problem, but there are also a number of other problems that need to be addressed, and especially there are areas for technical innovation that I think need to be applied to the emerging markets to help offset the very low ARPUs in these markets. Mostly the reason why companies stay away from these markets is because they can't figure out a way to make revenue. So any technical capabilities that we can apply to help with that issue is going to help solve the problem. So for example, the advances that are being promised by future standards like 5G in terms of the reduction of power consumption for network equipment and network operations, and the increase in battery life, that's going to be critical for the emerging markets. Anything that can help with technical advances in terms of cloud-based operations and the virtualization of network functions that typically reside in proprietary hardware and putting them in a cloud can greatly offset the operational and capital expenses of networks that we're going to deploy in the emerging markets. And then, as stated earlier, as we go to densify the highly, highly congested networks in these markets, and we use technologies like Wi-Fi or small cells, especially when they can rely on unlicensed spectrum. And that's not always true in these markets. Some of that spectrum is licensed and regulated. So there has to be policy work. But if we can find unlicensed spectrum and use alternative technologies to densify the networks, then we can lower some of the CapEx expenses that we encounter today. And then finally, the work that's going on with smart edges and local caches, once we can apply them, and we are beginning to apply them to the networks, we can, save greatly on the backhaul and the transport costs that are incurred when you try to bring all this heavy, dense, and high definition content to the end user. So I think that there's a lot of empirical evidence that shows that all those problems have to be solved, but what is most fundamental to bringing or to erasing the disparity between coverage and usage in the emerging markets are really having affordable and abundant access with high capacity networks. So people have to live within the range of networks that are not only highly reliable, carrier grade, but are also affordable. And then I think you'll see people start to get online along with, the relevant content and other sources of appeal for the internet in these countries. But we greatly at Google believe that it's fundamentally the network and the quality of the network and the affordability of the network that's going to be important. So I'm going to review with you very quickly just a couple of the network deployments, and mostly these are just to show you the paradigm that we use for network deployments at Google, and perhaps invite you to help us solve some of these problems with our future deployments. So one of the deployments that we have underway is a program that we have in place with the Indian government and the railways, where in partnership with them, we are building what will potentially become one of the largest public Wi-Fi networks in the world. And what Google has done is deployed the RAN network and optimized that, and then used fiber that the Indian railways had the foresight to lay along the tracks and pull that fiber into the station and use that for backhaul. We also use cloud-based operations as well as cloud-based NFVs. So it's a carrier-class Wi-Fi network. It's very highly reliable. Occasionally there are power surges that disrupt the service, as you would expect. But this service traverses all of India with the various climate zones and geographical terrains. So it's really being put to the test in terms of the roughness and the treatment that people apply to this network. We recently announced that we're going to turn this service into an actual product offering and bring this Wi-Fi technology to other places in the emerging world. And one of the reasons why is because we're seeing tremendous use for this network. We're getting on average about 15,000 new users a day. We expect by the end of the rollout to have about 30 million monthly active users. Data consumption has gone up by 20 times since we started deploying the network. So it's effective. Now, we were very fortunate to have a partner that had very rich backhaul, and that's not going to be true in most of the emerging markets. So another technique that we've used in deploying networks, and we'll be doing more of this, however, it will be in conjunction with partners, is to actually do our own build of a fiber network. And we've done this in different countries in Africa, where we've built a metro fiber hub. And what we do is we use it as shared infrastructure, and we wholesale it to ISPs and MNOs, and they in turn then offer it to their retail customers once they connect their sites to the metro hub. And Google is going to be expanding into other countries with this model in order to have sufficient and highly reliable backhaul. We, however, will not be doing it primarily through organic means, but through partnerships with other companies, governments, and NGOs. So on that note, I'm going to finish up and just say, there's not one solution for this entire globe. We have to have multiple solutions. We have to have multiple partners. There are different population densities, different geographical terrains and climate zones, and we need high altitude platforms, micro trenching, and all types of technologies. And I would ask that you consider partnering with Google to help solve some of these problems. Thank you.